All right, Ernie, would you just give us a quick introduction of your career and where you're working right now?
Absolutely. So my name's Ernest Stevens. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. I've lived in San Antonio my whole life. I'm home-based work still from San Antonio. I started out in law enforcement in my career. Well, it's been a while. Since 1992, I was a patrol officer for a small town called Terrell Hills here in San Antonio. And then in 1994, I joined the San Antonio Police Department, and I worked there for 27 years before I retired. And now I'm the Deputy Division Director at the Council of State Government's Justice Center. So I think it's important to know that during my time at the police department in San Antonio, is where I truly fell in love with the concept of mental health and crisis intervention training, and truly trying to understand the needs of the community, and then providing a service that we were able to not only connect with the community, but provide a level of treatment and care to make people in our community be successful.
Yes. And, we've spoken before about this. You actually did observe on some of those mental health calls, people having something you called hyper religiosity.
Yeah, and
And
that was a term that was given to us during training. Believe it or not, it was in 2003. The Houston Police Department came to San Antonio, and we began getting the CIT training, crisis intervention training. And they said these are some behaviors that you may see when you encounter somebody in a mental health crisis. And then the term religiosity, sorry, that
yeah,
was a
I know, we
fumbling
got to
word.
spell it out.
That word, that you may see it, and not necessarily meaning that's a dangerous behavior, but you need to, look at the context of it. What
Mm,
does it look like? How's it manifesting? Where is it manifesting? And then how is that affecting the individual that appears to be in some type of crisis? So yeah,
yeah.
that is where I actually first heard that term.
And then you said something like in all the calls, the mental health crisis calls, at least last year, you said 30 to 40% included some kind of spiritual or religious content.
Yeah, and I wish I could give you better statistics. I'm just going off of, responding to over, I've written over 15,000 involuntary commitments, and during that time, I know a lot of them included individuals that were experiencing some type of, it seemed at the time, and like a spiritual crisis because of the behaviors. The behaviors were actually placing that individual in some type of danger or somebody else in
Mm,
danger. Not so much that they were having this experience, but I think the resulting actions of what could occur if this behavior continued.
okay. And what were some things you saw? What did you notice on that call?
Yeah, well, I'll give you one example. I was working a security detail for a church at a park downtown, and it was called Joy of Jesus. And there's a local church here that would gather once a year, and they would hand out clothing and do, haircuts, massages, vaccinations, a sewing ministry. My wife actually was in the sewing ministry and would make pillows for
Mm,
people that were unhoused and hand them out there. So I was working security there, and an individual that was well known to the police department downtown, who's unhoused and has refused services multiple times, came walking through the park, and he could see, he could hear the music. He saw people worshiping and praying, and before you know it, he started going on and just started laying hands on
right.
people and praying for them. Now, normally, like in a church setting, something like that, even amongst people, that's not unusual.
Right.
But this individual, um, I'm trying to describe him as delicately as I can, but he had very long hair that was unkept. His clothing was very disheveled, and he was extremely dirty.
Mm,
He mumbled and would scream at
mm,
people, and as he was approaching them and trying to touch them, it was scaring them.
mm,
And it came to one point where people were trying to intercept him before I could get there and tell him, hey, this is an event, but if you're disturbing, we're going to ask you to leave. And things began to just escalate very quickly. So
mm,
that's one instant. I've seen numerous, but in that particular instant, you have to make a decision. Like, okay, and I'm trying to communicate with the individual, and his cognition appeared to be very disconnected from reality. He seemed to be very decompensated and couldn't answer questions of orientation, which raised another flag that I want to make sure he's not in a medical emergency. You know,
Mm.
if he's got, hypertension, diabetes, which is very prevalent in San Antonio. So I wanted to make sure, hey, is this a psychiatric emergency? Is this a medical emergency? Could it be a traumatic brain injury? It
Mm.
takes time to try to, truly assess an individual, and it's helpful when they can respond to you and help you with that assessment. In
Yeah.
this particular case, that wasn't the case, and he became nonverbal and very combative.
Mm. So just to cover a few other examples, I think we originally talked about, did you ever see like writing on the walls when you went to a house? So again,
Yeah,
what were
yeah,
some things you saw that started tipping you off that something spiritual, religious, or hyper religiosity is happening?
yeah. So there was another patient. We got called out to an apartment complex. Her doctor called us to do a welfare check and said that she had missed her last two appointments and hadn't refilled her prescriptions. So he asked us to go out there and check on this patient. And when we got there, the first thing I noticed that kind of was out of the ordinary was a padlock system on the outside of the door,
Mm.
which tells me that when the resident leaves, they probably put a padlock on for whatever reason,
Mm.
besides the normal locking door mechanism, right? So that was strange. I hadn't really seen that. But when the patient answered the door, the individual, she demanded to look inside of my ears to make sure there were no wires coming out,
Mm.
because she wanted to make sure that I wasn't recording her, our conversation. But when I walked in, her walls were covered from baseboard to crown molding with pages of the Bible. She
Gotcha.
had them scattered all over the walls,
Mm.
which, it's unusual, not against the law by any means. But then you have to look at the rest of the apartment. She
Mm.
had all her air conditioning vents blocked off with garbage bags,
Mm.
and no food at all in the refrigerator.
Mm.
So we got to talking, and first thing was she didn't want people pumping gas into her apartment. So that's why she taped off her air vents. In Texas, it gets very, very hot,
Mm.
and it was very hot that day in that apartment. There was no food, and the only food I saw was left out and molded.
Mm.
But when I began to talk to her, she began quoting scriptures,
Mm.
and which is fine. She asked me if I was a Christian. She asked me if I believed in Jesus. Um, and they teach you in training, hey, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, don't talk
Mm.
about, but if you're truly trying to connect with somebody, and that's their mode of trying to connect with you, then I say show some empathy
Mm.
and try to connect with them with where they are.
Mm.
And for me, it was very easy to be vulnerable in that moment and authentic about who I was and my beliefs. And I think that helped build just a rapport with her that most officers probably wouldn't have taken the time. They're just going to look
Yeah.
around and be like, oh, this person's out of their mind and you've got to go. And it's like, but what behavior is she doing that's truly placing her in danger? Right.
Right.
That's what we had to look at. So then
Right.
you have to dig a little deeper, right? How long's it been since you've eaten? How long
Mm.
are you eating? Do you know what today is? You know who the president is? Just
Mm.
questions of orientation. So I can kind of find out, hey, is your cognition okay? Do you have somebody that we can call and check on you, or
Mm-hmm.
are you so decompensated to where now you're placing yourself in a danger, and we need
Yes.
to get you some assistance. So there's a fine line, but I think it truly comes down to how have you been trained, and are you willing to truly try to connect with an individual that's in crisis?
Yeah. Yeah. And the topic we're talking about is somebody that slips into their religion to such an extreme that they are not doing some of the basic things like food and etc.
Well, you say that, and it reminds me of one more patient. I'm sorry for going on, but like I said, these
This is
were a lot
good.
of times, yeah, these calls were very prevalent. We had one individual that had written a paper on how he thought he could solve world hunger, and he wanted it read at a G something summit. I don't know which one he was talking about, And until they read his letter and responded to him, he was never going to eat again.
I
And
remember
it
that
had
one.
been, yeah, and it had been like a week or so, and he was very educated. Hey, he had his PhD. I mean, this man's very educated. But he said that God told him that he's not to eat, and that his plan was to plant fruit trees all up and down the highways in
Mm,
the interstates. So, like when a natural disaster hits and people have to flee from a hurricane, then they could stop and gather fruit
mm,
along the highway so they'd have something to eat. And if you did this all around the country, it could solve world hunger. And
mm.
he had this just elaborate plan that went on and on and on. And the plan in and of itself, that's one thing. But when you stop eating because um, you you hear God telling you don't eat um, ever again until they accept this plan,
Mm,
then you have to look at, are you placing yourself in imminent danger?
yeah.
Right. And that was, it's sad when you're placed in a position like that as a first responder, because you have somebody that truly believes, right, that they're doing what they're being asked to do. And
Yes.
if you look at other cultures and the way that they connect with their high power, I think the first thing comes to mind are Native Americans.
Yes.
They will smoke opioids. They'll have these delusional, I don't know what word you want to call it, but their mind becomes free to where
Yeah.
they feel like they can connect to their spirit, right? We don't go on to reservations, arresting them and putting them in hospitals because that is their belief. That's their culture. But in the United States, that's an abnormal culture response to what we have defined as normalcy.
Yes.
And you got to question that. Like, is that, where is the line for that? And are you truly trying to make a difference and help somebody? Or are you following the leader of the way things have always been done because that's the way they've always been done?
Yes. And that's a bigger conversation that we'll see if you want to come back into it, because it does go into, is there a community, a religious community or a spiritual community that embraces, this person, and are they going to protect and care for that person? Well, then that, in a Native American culture, that may be so because the community does embrace that process. So, you out there as a first responder to respond to a situation, you don't have the community around. There's not a group of grandmothers and grandfathers saying, "Oh no, we got them. We're gonna hold them. We're gonna take care." So that's part of what's missing. Um, but
Yeah, and the faith-based community, they're not alone in this struggle, because we would receive calls from churches saying, "Hey, we've
tell
got
me,
an individual in here right now that's causing a disturbance, and we need you to escort them out." I've got called to a mosque before, and before I could even enter, I was being asked to take off my boots because I
mm,
wasn't allowed to walk on the carpet.
mm,
And I'm like, well, I'm gonna be slipping around. What if this turns into a struggle and then I don't have
mm,
boots on? And you just have to find your way to circumvent the environment that you're in, but also try to
mhm.
understand like what's truly going on here in the moment, and what resources do I have available to me that's going to be able to help? Not
Yes,
just where can I go and get rid of this person as quickly as I can, because I truly don't feel comfortable in dealing with this, because I'm not truly trained and informed on what I'm dealing with. And I just want to get to the next call because this one makes me uncomfortable. And I think
yeah.
that's unfair to the patient. I truly do.
Yeah, and again, there's another topic here that we may or may not be able to get into, but as we started working with clergy from all religions, it became kind of a comment that says clergy are not prepared to handle these situations. In some churches or some religions, a clergy might be able to handle it inside their church, or mosque or whatever, but in some situations like that one, they didn't, and they're frightened of it. So again, kind of beyond of what we're going to do today. So I want to go into the other few questions
Sure.
that there's training all over. Um, so what kind of training did you go through? Literally, I think in a year when we first spoke of this to get so educated on spiritual emergency, Stan Groff's. What did you do to educate yourself?
No, for me, it was being connected with the community. Being a member of NAMI and going and connecting with the faith-based community, I think was something that was very, very important. We held our training at a church. So we had a pastor that would come, greet everybody, and open up the training day one with a prayer, which I thought was a wonderful setting, a safe setting for everybody. And I was always just interested in, because I remember asking my pastor working at these events in the park, saying, "Hey, pastor, how do I know, when somebody's in a psychiatric crisis versus having a spiritual connection?"
Mm,
And he said, basically, you have to look at what is being said or being done in that moment. Is that person um, uh, thrashing about and being disorderly?
mm,
Because that would not be of the Lord. The Lord
right.
expects order
Mm,
and things to be done in fashion. Now, he did talk about, Jesus flipping over the tables in
yeah.
anger, but he put it in context for me. So it made it easier for me to understand. So a lot of this truly was seeking out this information on my own, because I truly wanted to deliver the best possible service and treatment I could to people that I was coming in contact with.
And some of that study on your own, you literally knew the term spiritual emergency. You knew Stan Groff's work, so you were becoming more articulate in, oh, there's a real thing called spiritual emergency, right?
Yeah, because Stan really talks about, the advent of culture and how much that has to do with how we define whether you want to call it a spiritual emergency, a spiritual connection, or here in the United States through training, the hyper religiosity.
Yeah.
It's just, but words matter, um, because optics matter on how you treat people. So I think it's important
Yes.
that we have a shared language.
Yes. So I want to look at two groups. One is just police officers. If they're called, we don't have a mobile response unit and therapists and all, just the police. One of the recommendations I made last time, and I want to see your opinion, is we just want police officers to be aware enough that hyper religiosity or religious experience is a real thing. It's not just all psychotic. So we'd like the police officer to be able to say, all right, I need to bring you into the ER anyway. I do. That's the decision. But that the police officer actually makes a statement to the ER that says, do you know that there's a thing called a religious experience? And can you put that down? Because we observed it. So that would be advocating for the person. Is that
It,
realistic?
it is, and I'll tell you what's ironic about that here in San Antonio. When we take a patient to a hospital, it's usually a Methodist hospital, a Baptist hospital, a
Mm,
Christus Rosa, which is a Catholic sponsored hospital. So we're taking them to hospitals that align themselves, right, with different groups of beliefs. Yet it's very difficult to, sometimes I've had to search out a Bible because I've had a patient say, "Hey, can I read a Bible here?" I'm like, yeah,
yes.
there's got to be one here somewhere. It's a Methodist hospital. And it took
Mm,
me almost 45 minutes before I could find somebody to find one. And when you're a patient in there, for example, my wife was in the hospital not long ago. We had clergy come by and check on her. But I don't see that happening on psychiatric wards. Not that I'm aware of. Now, I'm not saying
yeah.
it doesn't happen. I've just never seen it in my 15 plus years in working on a mental health unit.
Thank you. Um, where another topic for another day. I've got invited on a psychiatric ward in the last few months, escorted by a chaplain.
Oh, wow.
And
Fantastic.
what a great experience. And so one of our major hospital systems in New Jersey hires chaplains to be available to actually walk the psychiatric floor, not avoid it like most hospitals. So it's actually happening in New Jersey.
Oh,
And
that's fantastic to
yeah,
hear that.
we'll pick that up. I'm watching the time. We have less than 5 minutes. So now, what would be your advice to mobile response units that my assumption is they have more time to sit and talk. You tell me, than a police
Yeah,
officer.
so community responder programs are becoming very, very popular. So when I say that, that's normally going to be some type of mental health professional or social worker paired up with maybe somebody with a medical background, like a emergency medical technician. So usually you have law enforcement removed from that type of response. But the training can be comparing apples to oranges, right? Because you'll have officers go through a 40-hour crisis intervention training to learn how to de-escalate, do active listening, learn about federal laws like EMTALA, things like that. Community responder programs, we're just now starting to look at, well, what is the training? What are they getting? Because I know on the law enforcement side, we get very little instruction when it comes to dealing with somebody in a spiritual emergency. So I can't even imagine, what it looks like on a community responder side, because you're taking a different approach, right? Law enforcement, and it depends on what state you're in, on how you're setting up these co-response teams. And I'll say it very quickly. In Texas, only a peace officer, judge, or parent or guardian can do an involuntary commitment. So when you build out your co-responder teams, it seems to make more sense to have an officer attached to these teams. So when they're in the field, if they need to do an involuntary commitment, they can do one. If you're in Texas and we have a community responder team and they meet up with somebody that meets the criteria for an involuntary commitment, they can't do it. So then they're going to have to call an officer to come out to the scene, and then things can change and there can be differing opinions and things like that. So I say all that to say this: training is very decentralized. I think we must have a centralized type of training, that whether you're building out a community responder program or a co-responder program, that at least the training is aligned, so that when an officer shows up on scene to a community responder, again, I said earlier, shared language, this helps the communication process, which in the end helps the patient.
Yes, yes. So, is it fair to say that the community responder teams would be able to get more training in the spiritual part? Like, this is in the DSM, it's a V code, it needs to be included. When you see this, it's not just crazy, it's, something. Is that a correct assumption, that they should be able to get more training and actually address that more than a police officer?
Well, I think if you're a responder to a community crisis, you should have the training, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if I show up in a badge or if I show up in plain clothes. The problem is the problem, and I need to connect with the person, right? So I can't get caught up in what the problem is. I really truly need to focus on the person. And in order to do that, I think proper training across the board for both first responders and community responders needs to align, so we have a better understanding of what exactly we're seeing in the community, because it's no different from the fire department responding. They're responding to the same calls that the police department is responding to, yet the training's different. Because I've seen them come through the training. Police officers use more of a tactical approach, and firefighters and medics are more hands-on, touchy-feely. Let me check your pulse. Are you feeling okay? Do you normally run a fever? And they're very good at communicating, where officers are a little bit more standoffish because they're very tactical. They're very aware of their surroundings. And you feel that as a patient, you feel that. And it makes a difference. And I think if we could just learn better approaches through education, it will help out.
Quick last question, and if I could, I might just call you so I don't close so abruptly. What's your opinion on including clergy
I
in
love it.
988? Talk to me.
Yeah, I love it, because if you call 988 right now, you're going to get a recording, and then you can press 1 for veterans. You can choose the LBTQ. You can choose youth. Why not have an option for, I need to talk to somebody within clergy that can better understand my crisis right now? I think it's a great idea.
Great. So, we want to make a movement first in New Jersey, but across the nation, to include the spiritual part of mental health.
One step at a time, my friend.
That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. So, I would love to talk to you. Oh, here we go. Let me just stop.